Alright, now we're going to talk about two of the movies that came out over this past weekend. One for Netflix and one that's just kind of in general on demand and I think is in some select theaters. But I want to start with The Trial of Chicago 7, which of course is the new Aaron Sorkin movie, which had me really, really excited, not just because it was a new Aaron Sorkin movie, but the cast list was insane. And I do remember when I think Spielberg had this a while back, and I think Will Smith was going to play Bobby Seale, and even I could be imagining this. I want to say Joseph Gordon-Levitt was involved back then too, but I can't remember who else there was. But I remember this was, and I think it was The Trial of Chicago 10 is what it was called back then. Because obviously this is a story you can find with a bunch of different incarnations. There was the animated documentary thing I think was just called Chicago 10, and then there was one with Thomas Ian Nicholas played Abby Hoffman. I don't know if anybody saw that, but it exists as well. I think it was called Chicago 8 or something, but it's yeah. There's a lot of different incarnations of the story as far as at least film goes. And it's one of those cases where I wasn't all that familiar with the story. I knew like who some of the people were, and vaguely what had gone down here. But other than that, usually I research this stuff like going like before I go into it. But for this particular case, because Sorkin has a way of just being so gripping in himself, I kind of just wanted to kind of go in as vague as possible, and then I'd kind of look into and research it afterwards to see what's accurate and what isn't. And what's interesting about this movie, it is one of those cases where some of it might seem grounded enough that it's real, but it's actually something that was done for dramatic purposes. And there's some stuff that might seem way over the top and dramatic that actually did really happen, and in some cases they may have even toned down a little bit to make sure it didn't seem too unbelievable. That's not to say there's not some stuff that's very, big and overdramatic that is just that and didn't actually happen, but that just kind of comes with the territory. Obviously, stuff like that's going to be in here also, especially with somebody as theatrical as Sorkin. And I say that in a loving way, but some people may say that in a more critical way. But when you go into it, it wasn't quite as I mean, I know some people are getting a bit worn out on Sorkin and the way he does things and how it's almost like he's getting a bit predictable and how you can pinpoint the way his characters speak or maybe some specific lines they might say that are continuous throughout his work. But I don't know. I still think it's gonna be a while before I'm like totally sick of him. Though I can understand where it can be like where it can probably seem a bit pretentious and very full of itself. And there's some lines even in this where it's like it's kind of it doesn't come off as clever as it might have sounded to him on paper, or when it was in his head before it got on paper. But yeah, there is a lot of introduction here, which kind of leaves a lot of stuff. It feels like there's a lot on the table kind of at once if you don't know the story going in because there's a lot of characters you have to get to know, and it's one of those movies that starts where like every character is introduced with like text on the screen, and it feels like we're getting a lot of information at once. But he does find some playful ways to introduce that, where it's like this where we're introduced to each character individually in this opening scene, and it's like the way the scenes flow into each other. It's like each character, despite being in a different location in a different scene, is completing the sentence that another character started in a previous scene, and so on. And it's like a whole chain reaction of how we meet each person, which is nice and clever and helpful for the most part. But some of them are still. It's sort of like a Suicide Squad scenario where it's like we do get the introduction, but then every now and then it'll just be like, oh, by the way, this person and this person are really crucial too, but you didn't meet them before, and so you kind of have to try to gather everything. But once it gets going, as I imagined in the moment and at that particular time, once it gets going, everything falls into place and it's not hard to follow or anything like that. though there are a lot of characters and a lot of names to keep track of. But luckily, we have a lot of familiar faces that go with those names, and that usually helps a lot also. Um, and yeah, that's one of the things that really drew me to this outside of Sorkin's involvement was the magnificent cast that we have here with Eddie Redmayne is kind of I don't want to say like nobody's really like in the front, nor does anybody really like stand out in some gigantic way more so than the other cast, because I know with a movie like this a lot of people are talking about if somebody's going to get nominated for this, who will it be? And I've heard like three different names at least thrown around. um, and that's kind of hard to say at the moment because, like I said, they work just so well as an ensemble. It's almost difficult to even single anybody out because I was kind of doing that throughout it, where it's like just when you think, oh, that person's a standout of the cast, somebody else will have a really standout scene, like maybe one or two scenes over, and it's just continuous, and everybody gets kind of a big moment at one point or another. But I do think something that really stands out here is the sort of back and forth between particular characters. Because if I personally had to pick a standout begrudgingly, I would say Mark Rylance. Because he's not only does it just kind of feel like he's kind of the most experienced out of the cast, maybe outside of Frank Langella, where it's just like pretty much any time ever, no matter what kind of movie it is, every time Mark Rylance plays a character, they feel so lived in already. Um, where it's like he's one of those actors where you will never see the actor, you only see the character. And that's especially the case here, where it's like everything that like comes out like because Sorkin's dialogue is known for being like really really snappy, but it's like almost but until he gets to the point where he has to kind of lose his cool, which he does extremely believably. You get the sense that Rollins's character has really carefully thought out everything he's gonna say before he says it. And it's not just coming out spontaneously like you'd expect out of a typical Sorkin script or a Sorkin character. But and yeah, obviously these are real people, but once you take real people and put them in a Sorkin script, they become a Sorkin character, for sure. But the dynamic that really stands out here is, well, really Mark Rylance with anybody. Like he's got some really great scenes with Eddie Redmayne towards the end, but the back and forth between him and Frank Langella is really the meat of this movie, I think, because it is one of those cases where it's pretty obvious that, especially being a Sorkin script, and we've seen stuff like A Few Good Men, that even though the characters kind of have that snappy dialogue that they do and stuff like that. Whether it feels real or not, as long as it's engaging, then the movie is doing its job. But it's the back and forth between him and Langella that really stands out, because it's almost like a battle between the two. Because I lost my train of thought there for a second. What I was gonna say was we're going into the afternoon and I haven't slept yet, so I'm not gonna remember anything I'm saying right now. But I was gonna say it's obvious that the courtroom scenes are gonna be why we're here, and it's gonna be the real standout of the movie itself. And anything that's not the courtroom scenes is probably gonna seem a bit underwhelming by comparison. But they still managed to handle that when we get scenes like it's really interesting when we see once the courtroom scenes have started, when we see Joseph Gordon-Levitt outside of the courtroom because he's on the other side, and we have Sacha Baron Cohen and Jeremy Strong run into him in a park while he's out with his kids, and it's sort of like when you're a kid and you see your teacher outside of school, and just how kind of weird the whole thing is and how out of place it seems. And I really like the way that scene went down. But for the most part, obviously, it's going to be either the courtroom scenes themselves, and particularly those Rylance Langella scenes, or it's going to be when they're building up to what they're going to say in court. Are going to be the really meaty scenes, and everything else is kind of leaves a little bit to be desired and isn't quite as really just not as Sorkin-y as you may expect, at least at the start. But then once we're getting to a point where a lot of things are starting to come together at once, then the editing really kind of gets to take the kind of front and center here, because and sometimes it can seem a bit much, especially when you're working with a Sorkin script. Like even though Sorkin's directing this, still it's like you can see him so much in, whether it be Fincher doing The Social Network, or Danny Boyle doing Steve Jobs, or whatever, or even Bennett Miller doing Moneyball, which he co-wrote with Steven Zaillian. But still, like when Molly's Game came out, it's like it was hard to even tell much of a difference. I mean, you can, because obviously, despite feeling very, very Sorkin, Social Network's also 100% Fincher, but there's still, he has enough of a voice that comes through just in the writing alone, that's pretty much kind of, it does feel like there's a missing piece in like this and Molly's Game movies that he actually directed. Where there might be a flair there that's not quite there, but the editing is when it really comes into play and really starts to feel very like a Sorkin thing. So we get these moments where we're introduced to the undercover cops that were working with them, that were assigned to them, and them being revealed to be cops through the editing. And it's like we see them meet them, and then we see them testifying, and then we see a lot of stuff where Sacha Baron Cohen's on stage and he's talking about what's going on, and we're seeing different testimonies, and we're just cutting back and forth between all these, and this is how we're getting the information. Because we're not actually seeing the events yet, in regards to what they're on trial for exactly. But the way all these come together, and sometimes they use real footage, but for the most part, it's kind of this back and forth, and we're getting like the most lively exposition ever, which is what Sorkin does best. So, and those scenes really, that's when the movie just really, really comes to life. Is those scenes where we're kind of getting all the information from all the different sources, and sometimes it adds up, and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes somebody will say something that doesn't quite match up with this person, and so on. And we're all kind of getting a almost Rashomon type look at what exactly happened before we kind of see the actual lead into it. And that's just really exciting. So there's that. But talking about some of the other people that are in the cast list here, I mentioned Sacha Baron Cohen a few times, and that he's somebody that I kind of knew. Apparently, he was really concerned about doing an American accent and all that, and I guess playing this type of character in general. But for some reason, I just don't really have any doubt when it comes to him as an actor. Uh, and I do think he really owned this in his own way for sure. Because I think I read that Sorkin had told him that he didn't want it to be an impression; he wanted it to be an interpretation. Which Cohen didn't really get as far as direction goes, but I can see what he pretty much means by that. Because obviously there's gonna be quite a few fictional things in the movie, regardless. And so to kind of do it in this way to where it almost feels like a version of reality rather than trying to be almost documentary-like, is something that I don't mind, and I never really minded, and I still don't really get the way people still, in 2020, can go into movies that are based on true stories and want it to be 150,000% accurate and not be in any way dramatized the way movies have been doing that for 100 years. But that's why the documentaries exist. That's why that animated documentary exists. Because obviously, if Sorkin's going to do something, it's going to be super dramatic in one way or another. But I got sidetracked. But yes, what's interesting about Cohen is you would almost expect, I guess because you expect his comedy characters, that he would be maybe like really over the top. But while the character certainly requires a certain liveliness, I guess you could say, there's plenty of subtlety in there also. Like when he actually gets to take the stand, is a really good scene, and not as over dramatized as you would expect it to be, given all the way his character's been up to this point. But then there's also just really subtle things that are in there. Like there's a moment where John Carroll Lynch's character ends up sort of making a scene, and which is kind of out of character for him. And Cohen's off to the side. Like there's no attention drawn to it at all. Cohen is like off to the side of the screen and just kind of like nodding in like appreciation and admiration for this. But then again, this is also a scene that is apparently rubbing people the wrong way, and which I can totally see why, given that the character that John Carroll Lynch is playing was very famous for being a pacifist, and Sorkin has added a scene to add drama where he, even though he immediately regrets it, he still punches a dude, which is which is completely out of character and something that clearly didn't happen. That kind of thing where it like goes completely against what the actual dude stood for. That kind of criticism I can get behind in regards to something being dramatized. But as far as like the very last scene, and what that leads to, where it's like we get kind of a foreshadowing to it, in the middle that we don't really realize is foreshadowing, because it's a great moment in itself when they're kind of sitting around and they're talking about the case and all that, and then they all pause when the TV plays the names of the people who have gone down in Vietnam, and I didn't really expect them to bring that back and for that to have like a payoff of sorts. Um, but I know some people think the ending is like way too movie like and way too over the top, and once again, obviously something that didn't happen, especially in the way it's portrayed. But that's the kind of thing where I don't really, like I said, is you go into movies expecting them to movie, because that's their job, and when you can just look at it that way, then I think it's obviously it's super super cheesy, but I don't. It still felt like almost like a classic movie in a way, like a Mr. Smith kind of thing. I mean, I know Mr. Smith didn't end with like really cheesy '90s crowds cheering, but but even so, I just kind of got like a classic vibe from it that I kind of appreciated anyway, regardless of how cheesy and over the top it might be. Um, but then we also have stuff where it's like those Sorkin moments that really do stand out. I don't know if this is something that was actually said or not, but I did see like a link to the whole transcript that I didn't completely look at. But there's a moment where Rounce's character is about to really go off towards the end, and the first thing he does before he goes off on the judge is he looks at the stenographer and he says, "Are you any good? Because you're gonna have to try to keep up with me." Before he goes on his tirade, and it's just little things like that that really make Sorkin like his own recognizable voice. And it's like even if he is over the top, even if you can, see the patterns in his writing, it's still great to see a writer that has such a signature. Even so, especially one that you like can admire so much, regardless of how full of themselves they might get sometimes. Um, but then, like I was saying, there is some stuff that might seem over the top, but is actually a watered down version of what real life was, to my understanding. Like how much the judge is against them, like how Frank Langella's character almost seems like in any other movie, like in any other completely 100% fictional movie, would seem like a way over the top villain, and how much he goes against them. Um, but it's still, but apparently he was even worse in real life, to my understanding, at least from the little that I've read. Then there's also the case of Bobby Seale being bound and gagged in the courtroom, which once again is, if you don't know the story, sounds totally outlandish. Like there's no way that would have actually happened. And the really fucked up thing is not only did it happen, but apparently for like the movie just shows like a certain amount of time, and to my understanding, it was over the span of at least a few days. It was like that, which is, like I said, that there's some cases where you even have to water down real life, to make these semi-fictional movies seem believable, which is insane, but that's how it goes. Um, Somebody else I didn't mention being in the cast list is Michael Keaton, who was somebody I was really psyched to see, especially in a Sorkin project. But he has two scenes that start about an hour and a half in, and it's I'm not even sure if how heavily he's being. Well, he was just on a talk show promoting it, so he's at least somewhat advertised. But even so, being Keaton, it is the case where even though he only has two scenes, they're two really great scenes. Once again, to my understanding, over dramatized from real life, but still really big moments as far as drama goes. And if that's what you're looking for in a movie like this, it is absolutely here. So yeah, so like I said, if you came here for a Sorkin movie like I did, you're definitely gonna get that. It does kind of have like a bit of a not really a shoddy start, but maybe a slower start than you might expect with the way Sorkin stuff is usually paced. But once it hits its stride, which is still pretty early for the runtime at 2 hours and 10 minutes, it still really goes and really is engaging throughout. And like I said, a lot of that is due to Mark Rylance's performance, but honestly, like I said, it's really hard to say anybody stands out more than anybody else. Even Eddie Redmayne is really great here, and it's because obviously Eddie Redmayne is a very good actor. It's just with the Oscar bait stuff and Jupiter Ascending, it's become very easy to like make fun of him. But put that aside, he is a really great actor. So, and that's always been the case, regardless of all that other stuff. So, yeah. So I think that's pretty much where I stand on that. It took me a little while to get through it because Netflix was being a pain in the ass. I don't know if anybody else is having a bit of trouble with Netflix lately, where you're getting that error screen a lot. But that's yeah, pretty much all month I've been getting that shit. So I don't know if that's just a thing in general or that's my problem, but it doesn't matter. So let's go on to Love and Monsters, which is probably one of the more surprising movies of the year by far. I kind of just assumed this was going to be first off, I automatically assumed that it had like some sort of source material, like maybe it was a book or a series of books or something. But to my understanding, it's just kind of its own thing from the screenwriters. And when it opens, we start with Dylan O'Brien, who I always liked like when you see like the Maze Runner movies or that movie he did with Michael Keaton or whatever, or a few comedies here and there. When you're not accidentally confusing him with Logan Lerman, he's got a certain appeal to him, but he takes that appeal that he already had and takes it to like a whole other level with this. Like with a movie that's so effects driven the way this is, you wouldn't think that it would be up to the lead actor to like really. You have to really count on him to make the movie work. But you really have to count on him to make the movie work, and he actually does. Especially when it starts with this, we have this amusing introduction where we kind of see the start of this apocalypse through drawings. That's what his character does, and it does start off in that way that we've probably seen 100 times before, where we get the character that kind of sees it through this almost like sarcastic cynicism of sorts, and it's just kind of casual about things that are like really quite literally apocalyptic. And it's like, oh, it's going to be, a character sort of wisecracking through all this, drastic stuff, whatever. We've seen this character before, and it's played out and all that. But no, for just something about it, this character was appealing, like, right away. And I imagine a lot of what O'Brien brought to it has a lot to do with that. And it's like, this opening is so good and draws you in so much, and his narration and the way he's telling the story draw you in so much, that I forgot we were in the intro still until the title showed up. Because it's like a good 10-minute intro at least. Because after we get the drawings that kind of give us the backstory on the apocalypse and how it happened, we also get to see him have an encounter with a monster and see that we set up his character being the type that sort of freezes in the face of danger, and how he's going to obviously have to overcome that. but yeah, but it was a good enough intro that I was kind of into it right away. And usually, I actually, especially with movies like this that I'm not expecting to like as much as I do, I get kind of worried when I really like the opening 10 minutes or so because it's like usually it goes downhill. Like usually it has a really great setup and then it just sort of fucks itself over in one way or another. But no, this kept it up like the whole time. Like the only time it doesn't, I guess, is like the last 20 minutes. It kind of goes in a bit of an obvious direction that we've seen a billion times before. But everything leading up to that point is actually like almost shockingly good. Like I kind of couldn't believe how much I actually liked this consistently. Especially when we get into well, they threw in two things right away that I am just going to invest in, where it's there is a love story and there is a dog, and and those are the two things that are driving him from the 80 miles he has to trek across this apocalyptic land with all these gigantic monsters that are now at the top of the food chain. Um, and there's corpses and bones everywhere. Like people are not surviving on the surface at all. And now this dude that's afraid of his own shadow has to walk 80 miles just to get to the person that he loves that he hasn't seen in 7 years, because they got separated. And they said that they loved each other, and that's the last thing they said to each other before they got separated. Since then, they've just been talking through radio, and it was weird how quickly I got invested in this, because usually it's it's a teenage love story. Who gives a fuck, honestly? But I found myself unexpectedly invested when it got to the point to where they were saying their goodbyes before they went their separate ways in the flashback, before all the apocalyptic shit really really went down, and he looks like she looks like she's gonna say that she loves him, but then she doesn't. So she starts to walk away, and then he calls her name, and I found myself saying "Dude, say it, just say it, please say it." And he said it, and it was amazing. And then there was a little more suspense because it's like, oh God, is she gonna say it back? Oh God, please let her say it back. And she said it back, and it was great. And it was like, okay, this has been on for 10 minutes. We've known these characters for 2 of those minutes, and this is how into it I already am. So this is a really good sign. Especially being into the. It's one thing to be into the story that much, but when you're into the characters that much that early, that's when it's a really good sign. Um, and then we get this nice little transition where he got a new set of colored pencils because drawing is his thing. And then the transition shows us in the 7 years that have passed, they're down to this now. And I would think they'd be completely gone in 7 years, but we'll. I feel like within the rest of the context of the movie, it's not starting at the colored pencil transition. It was I feel like 7 years was maybe a too much of a gap. But that's the gap we're going with, so there it is, regardless of how believable it may or may not be. But this is a movie with giant bug creatures, so it doesn't matter what's all that believable when you're talking about stuff like that. Um, so yes, after they've got us invested in that, yes, he is one of the first things he meets on his journey is a very clever and lovable dog, which of course should get any person with a soul automatically invested. But then he also ends up meeting Michael Rooker and a little girl and stuff like that, and this is at the point to where, I mean, obviously it's always a good sign when Michael Rooker shows up in a movie, but if I was a little concerned at first because it's when you see, especially somebody that's afraid of everything, and it's when you see him by himself going on this journey, it's almost there's something that's really great about that to where you can it's more it's easier to invest in if it's just him by himself, because you can constantly be asking yourself, if it was just you in that scenario, what would you be doing? And it kind of gets you more attached to that character thinking that way. But it's the fact that he does eventually separate from them when the movie's still pretty early in. It never felt like it was intrusive to have more characters here. And I think it was kind of a step-by-step process, because he starts off by himself, then he meets the dog, then he meets a couple of humans, and then so on. And he even meets a robot at one point, and which is a bizarrely touching scene. Like that's another thing too, is the heartfelt moments in this, and how much they really hit. And like I said, I don't know if that's like you have to be invested from the get go for that to work or not, but it's so it's so interesting to me just how much the heartfelt stuff in this like really hits. Um, like it's the kind of thing that other movies like this, like Set in the Apocalypse, would barely acknowledge, if they even acknowledge it at all. And like to really make these great character moments out of it, and these really emotional moments. Like I said, even one involving a robot might be the most powerful in the movie, or at least the whole scene itself it's it's weird to even say that out loud, but it actually works. You just have to see it. But talking about sort of the main attraction of the movie, at least from a marketing standpoint, I guess, would be the monsters that he is either fighting or running away from. And yes, these things are enormous and terrifying and creative in their design and exactly what they do. It reminded me a lot of the monsters in Kong Skull Island, though maybe not near as terrifying as those, but stuff like there's a giant snail at one point that feels very much more like where what's scary about them is that they're gigantic, yet some of them can still blend in depending on what they are and what they look like. Um, and so that stuff like that really works also. Like the effects are really good. I mean, a lot of it's obvious CGI, obviously, but there's still some. To my understanding, there was some practical stuff kind of blending in there. But there's also a case of the human characters and the CGI creatures, and it's like if there's gonna be a sort of obvious distance between the two, but O'Brien is so convincing when he's either fighting one of these or running away from them or confronting one of them that it kind of eventually becomes seamless as long as you're invested in what he's doing. And it makes it all the more exciting and awesome and all that stuff. Um, and yeah, like I said, though eventually we do get to like the last 20 minutes or so, and it does go in a bit of an obvious direction. Especially since right before that, we reach a point to where it's like, it's so. Especially in a world like this, when it gets like real, when like the real emotions hit and like real sort of. Not necessarily completely real situations, but like the feelings each character has, particularly for the other, get sort of agonizingly real, for better or worse. And it's like to reach that kind of thing before we get to that last 20 minutes. And the last 20 minutes is still fine. But like I said, it's just kind of an obvious direction in a time where it was like we were going in a lot of interesting directions and had a lot of interesting directions to go in. Especially since the movie has you asking a lot, like, what is going to happen? Like, what is the next step once he accomplishes what he hopefully is going to accomplish? Um, and yeah, and then we get to the very end, and we set up some. I could never quite tell if they were going for sequel bait or not. They could be, or they could not be. Either way. But there is one particular message that they're going for, and like in any other time period, it would be like a really great message you can kind of, associate with, like, see it in an almost like allegorical way. But if you're gonna look at it that way, I don't think that's the best message for right now. But but as far as like within the movie, it's nice, and yeah. So I was into this a lot more than I thought I would be, to the point that I actually was thinking that, oh man, it's this kind of movie, and it's like maybe if I look back on it again or I watch it again, it'll be more of a guilty pleasure thing than a genuine, like actual, like the movie's genuinely good, but it didn't feel like that. I was like, I'm very curious if I go see why people don't like this movie, what the reasoning is, because so much of it works. so well. And so I went to Rotten Tomatoes and saw that at the time I am doing saying this now, it's at 92%, which was for some reason really surprising. Because like I just had this bad feeling it's like it's gonna be like people are gonna hate it. It's gonna be like in the 40s or something. But no, when it was like it's a 92, and it was like okay, so I'm on the right page, or I'm on the same page then. Obviously, there's no right and wrong as far as opinions go, but I'm on the same page in regards to it's hard to find faults in it. I'm sure people will, and I'm sure to them they're perfectly valid. But I think a lot of it's just a surprise factor. Also, like I never in a million years thought I would like a movie that looks like this much or be this invested in it and its characters and its emotional moments. But here they are. So yeah, it's perfectly titled because that's exactly it tells you exactly what's there and that's exactly what you get. So yeah. So I guess I can end this here. There's a lot of shit coming. It's mainly the reason I haven't slept yet is all the shit that's coming. So and that'll be going through the rest of the month. And then, as I've been saying, nobody knows what November is, but we'll figure that out. But in the meantime, we're gonna keep doing the horror thing until this is like the only like non-horror kind of break we're getting. Everything else is just gonna be horror for the entire rest of the month. Pretty much that or thriller, but obviously that line is thin. So, but you'll eventually see. So, and obviously we got another Netflix movie coming like right now, like today. Um, so that'll be happening also, and probably the movie that it is a remake of, and so on. So a lot, just endless shit is coming. So until all of that endless shit, that's it for now.